promised in my first Black Catholic Facts video, this video will discuss the Catholic Church and slavery. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel for all things Black Catholic. The information provided in this video is primarily from the book The History of Black Catholics by Cyprian Davis. I highly recommend that video. Some historians estimate that slavery has been in existence for 11,000 years. For purposes of discussing slavery as it relates to Black Catholics, I will begin in the 15th century. At the end of the Middle Ages, a substantial number of Africans taken into slavery as a result of the warfare between Christians and Muslims lived in Mediterranean countries and worked as agricultural laborers. Historian Charles Verlinden estimated that in the first part of the 15th century, 2/3 of the male slaves in Sicily were black. One of the most popular enslaved Africans came from this agricultural slavery. Saint Benedict the Moor was born in Sicily in 1526, and he died in 1589 a free man. Benedict's parents were both born into slavery, as was Benedict before he was freed by his slave owner. Benedict joined a group of hermits who followed the rule of St. Francis. He later entered a branch of the Franciscan order known commonly as the Brown Franciscans. Though he never was ordained a priest, he served a term as a superior of his community and became renowned as a counselor and advisor to many of the laity and clergy. His holiness was well known. Popular devotion to him spread throughout Italy, Spain, and into the Americas, where he became the patron saint of the black population, most of whom were slaves. He was not canonized until 1807 by Pope Pius VII. Next, I'm going to discuss Catholicism on the African continent, and in particular the Kingdom of Congo that is located in present-day Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Portugal allied itself with Afonso, the eldest son of Nzinga Anukwu, the 5th king of the Congo dynasty, who had converted to Catholicism. Afonso, known as Afonso the Good, wholeheartedly accepted the Catholic faith. After his father's death, both Afonso and his half-brother Mpazu Akatima had their eyes set on the throne. The two rivals met in a decisive battle at the capital of Mbanzu, Congo, and what happened next is the stuff of Catholic legend. According to Afonso's own account, his vastly outnumbered army appealed to St. James for assistance. The great apostle then miraculously appeared in the sky, along with 5 heavenly swordsmen, and the sight so frightened his half-brother's army that their superior force broke and abandoned the field. Afonso ascended the throne and ruled as the king of the Congo from 1506 to 1543. To commemorate his victory, Afonso devised a coat of arms emblazoned with 5 sword arms, the scallops of St. James, and broken idols. He made the feast of St. James a national holiday. King Afonso established Catholicism as the state religion of the Congo and declared the worship of idols illegal. He encouraged the founding of confraternities as well as missionary schools that instructed the Congolese aristocracy in Christian doctrine and in Latin. His son was even ordained a bishop by Pope Leo X. Afonso did so much to advance the Catholic faith during his reign that a contemporary Portuguese historian dubbed him the Apostle of Congo. Afonso had 2 goals: to convert his people to Catholicism and profit from the technological knowledge of the Europeans, and to control the Portuguese's appetite for riches and African slaves. he failed to accomplish both of these goals. Afonso was very earnest in his mission to convert his people to Catholicism and to end the practice of traditional religions. However, he agreed from the very beginning to supply slaves as part of the regular trade agreement. Slavery was found in practically all of the African civilizations and usually resulted from a person being captured in war or as a punishment for crimes. Afonso most likely did not know that the enslaved people he supplied to the Portuguese would become part of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. Afonso grew to regret participating in slave trading with the Portuguese, who seized Afonso's own people and even some of his family members. Afonso wrote in 1529 to the Portuguese king stating he wished to stop the sale of slaves because it was depopulating his country. However, the king said that wasn't possible. Though Afonso's eldest son was ordained a bishop, after his son died in 1531, the hope of direct access from the African kingdom to Rome died too. The reality of the slave trade drove many of Afonso's people against the church after his death in 1543. Slavery was very much an accepted institution in the world of the 16th and 17th centuries and was accepted by the Catholic Church leaders of the time. In the Middle Ages, Christians believed they had a legitimate right to enslave Muslims, just as Muslims had made Christian slaves through war. So Europeans considered Africans Muslims and therefore able to be enslaved. Catholic nations such as Spain, Portugal, and France had legislation of the Church that insisted that slaveholders baptize their slaves and ensure their right to religious practice. However, there was a vast discrepancy between the theory and practice. With the arrival of colonizers to the Western Hemisphere, so too came Africans to work the vast plantations. African slaves who were already part of the Spanish population arrived in the Americas with the Spanish colonizers. By 1510, Africans began to be imported from the African mainland. Between 1502 and 1866, 11.2 million Africans were taken to the Americas. 388,000 arrived in North America, while the rest went to Brazil, the British and French Caribbean, and Spanish territories, in that order. Over 1.5 million black people were imported into Latin America from 1595 to 1773 alone. Both the Spaniards and Portuguese laws demanded that all Africans brought over were baptized either at the port of embarkation or at the port of entry. Here we meet another saint, Peter Claver, a Jesuit priest born about 1580 in Verdú, Spain. He came to the Spanish colony of New Granada in South America, that is today the country of Colombia, where he was ordained a priest in 1616. At that time, 1,000 slaves landed there every month. After Peter Claver's ordination, he dedicated himself by a special vow to be at the service of the Africans enslaved. He labored unceasingly for the salvation of the African slaves and the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. He spent his life ministering to the Africans who were brought over to be slaves. Most were suffering psychologically and physically after the horror of the Middle Passage, the Atlantic voyage that brought the Africans from their homeland to the Americas. For over 30 years, St. Peter Claver ministered to the spiritual and bodily needs of the slaves, those who were ill, the prisoners, those condemned to death, the lepers, and the abandoned. He learned at least one African language and would use interpreters to translate for him. It is believed that through his efforts, 300,000 souls entered the church. He died on September 8, 1654, was canonized in 1888, and was made the patron of missions to people of African descent. St. Peter Claver lived according to his motto, Peter Claver, ever the slave to the Ethiopians. The word Ethiopians is a generic name in Greek for a black African. Another Jesuit who worked with St. Peter Claver was Alonso de Sandoval. He observed the grim conditions Africans experienced under slavery in Peru. By his account, the typical African, whether agricultural laborer or household servant, toiled from dawn to dusk, went about almost naked unless he worked on Sunday and feast days to obtain money for clothing, was miserably fed, received no medical attention, and was harshly, even sadistically punished for the most frivolous reasons. According to Sandoval, Christian slaveholders punished the slaves more in a week than the Moors did in a year. Amidst these horrid conditions for people of African descent in the Americas arises another saint, St. Martin de Porres. He was born out of wedlock in Lima, Peru in 1579 to a Spanish nobleman and a freed black woman originally from Panama. After being educated in Ecuador, St. Martin returned to Lima, where he apprenticed himself as a barber surgeon. In 1603, Martin made vows as a Dominican lay brother, which was highly unusual because the Council of Indies had decreed that no Indian, mestizo, or mulatto could be ordained a priest or professed as a religious in the Spanish colonies. This was a form of racism that eventually crippled the South American Church. Martin became a one-man charity for people of African descent in the Americas. Serving as an infirmarian, barber surgeon, and pharmacist who brought healing and compassion to the abandoned slaves, native outcasts, and orphan children. For 40 years he lived out his calling as father of the poor. As Cyprian Davis states, quote, "In St. Martin de Porres, Africa's roots bore fruit in holiness. Through him, Africa's sons and daughters made the Catholic Church their own." End quote. St. Martin was canonized in 1837 and is still the only saint of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. He is the patron saint of social justice, racial harmony, and mixed-race people. Moving to North America, the first black Catholic that arrived in what was Mexican territory and trekked through what is now Florida, Texas, and Arkansas was named Esteban. Esteban was born in Morocco and was a slave who voyaged with 3 white men in 1536. They came with the goal of evangelization of the native people. Esteban was a resourceful, intrepid explorer who survived shipwreck, disease, captivity, and physical hardship before being killed by Zuni Indians. The Spanish colony St. Augustine was established in 1565 in what is now northern Florida. To the present day, it is the oldest non-Indian town in the continental United States, and its church is the oldest parish. It was primarily a military outpost to protect the Spanish holdings from the threat of the English and French. As both a military post and settlement, St. Augustine is the oldest home in the United States for people of African descent who were both free and enslaved. Spanish authorities invited slaves in the English settlements in the Carolinas and Georgia to escape slavery and find refuge in Florida. They were promised they would receive their freedom if they converted to Catholicism. From the end of the 17th century to 1763, These escaped slaves found a home in a free black settlement just to the north and east of the town of St. Augustine and its fort, the Castillo de San Marcos. In 1740, an English governor of Georgia led a military attack on the Florida colony. Members of the black population formed part of the fighting force that defended St. Augustine and eventually drove the British away from Fort Mose and the Florida coast. In both the 17th and 18th centuries, the population of St. Augustine included free black people, enslaved people, and a garrison of black soldiers from Cuba. The Parochial Registers from 1565 to 1763 are still extant and are the oldest ecclesiastical documents from the United States, in which black people are mentioned in all of them. In 1763, after Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, which ceded the colony of Florida to the British, all Spaniards, including the black population, moved from Florida to Cuba. From 1763 to 1784, when Great Britain controlled Florida, Catholicism nearly disappeared. Nearly 25 years before the Treaty of Paris, in 1739, South Carolina was reaching a breaking point. With the expansion of the plantation system, slaves outnumbered the free population by almost 2 to 1. Many of the newer slaves were born in Africa, and of those, almost all were Congolese and Catholic. From these people, a group led by a man named Jemmy plotted their escape from slavery. They gathered on Saturday, September 8th, the feast day of the Nativity of Our Lady, and the most important day of the week in Congo, when they prayed the rosary and asked for Our Lady's intercession for God's deliverance. On the morning of September 9th, about 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stono River. They took guns and weapons, then killed 2 shopkeepers. They displayed the shopkeepers' heads on pikes and marched south toward promised freedom in the Spanish settlement in Florida. The armed group played drums, flew flags of the Marian color white, and chanted "Liberty." They attacked plantations and gathered more followers on the way. The slaveholder militia mobilized and put down the rebellion, executing 40 freedom fighters and lining the road with their heads, one at every mile. Altogether, 60 people died in the largest slave rebellion in British North America. In the aftermath, the colonial government enacted harsher slave codes that further dehumanized slaves and intensified the moral injury that slaveholders had inflicted on themselves. Nearly 44 years later, another freedom fighter was born in 1743 in the West Indies. Toussaint Louverture was the son of an educated slave who lived in Santo Domingo. He acquired through Jesuit contacts some knowledge of French, though he wrote and spoke it poorly, usually employing Haitian Creole and African tribal language. Winning the favor of the plantation manager, he became a livestock handler, healer, coachman, and finally steward. Legally freed in 1776, he married and had 2 sons. Toussaint was homely, short, and small-framed. He was a fervent Roman Catholic. On August 14, 1971, representative slaves from nearby plantations gathered in the woods in the French colony of Santo Domingo to hold a secret ceremony that served as both a traditional African religious ritual and strategic meeting to plan the revolt against the ruling white enslavers. The ceremony is considered the official beginning of the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint became one of the most prominent military generals in the revolution. Though he died in prison in 1803, The revolution continued, and the people of African descent ultimately won independence from France on January 1st, 1804, thereby becoming the first country to be founded by former slaves. Across the United States, American slavery existed in one of its most brutal modern forms, and marked the American Catholic Church in a way that no other American institution would. Many Catholic families were slaveholders. Religious organizations like the Jesuits, Vincentians, Sulpicians, Capuchins, the Ursuline nuns, the Carmelite nuns, the Daughters of the Cross, the Religious of the Sacred Heart, the Visitation nuns, the Dominican sisters, the Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of Loretto, to name a few, all owned enslaved people. In 1838, Pope Gregory XVI condemned the slave trade. The attitude toward slavery differed among the Catholics in the United States. Many bishops and lay people were slave owners. Even for those who accepted slavery as a necessary evil, moral and canonical problems existed. People questioned if missionaries should disturb the conscience of slaveholders. They asked if slaves should be forced to work on Sundays and feast days, when rest was required by the Catholic faith. A larger issue was that enslaved people could only marry if the slaveholders permitted it, but most owners did not consent because it was not in the owner's best interest. So the enslaved found it morally impossible to contract a valid marriage, going against the Council of Trent's decree that a Catholic marriage was not valid unless the vows were exchanged before a priest and 2 witnesses. Secret marriages were no longer considered valid. Slavery was also a huge hindrance to evangelization and preaching the gospel. The enslaved were not able to freely learn about or practice their religion, nor were they allowed to evangelize with others to spread the gospel. In spite of Pope Gregory's condemnation of the slave trade, some Southern bishops considered themselves apologists for slavery and felt obligated to defend it on the basis of Catholic tradition and scripture. John England, who became the first bishop of Charleston, South Carolina, in 1820, published a series of 18 public letters in which he attempted to prove that Gregory XVI meant to condemn the slave trade as practiced by the Spanish and Portuguese, and not the domestic slavery found in the American South. He argued slavery has always existed and been accepted. However, Cyprian Davis states his arguments betrayed him. Quote, "The legislation in the Old Testament, the canons of the church councils, the jurisprudence of Roman law, and the teaching of the popes all sought to ameliorate the condition of the slaves and to recognize the existence of certain rights that accrued to the person of the slave, especially regarding marriage, family life, freedom from sexual exploitation, and even certain property rights. The slavery system in the southern states recognized no such rights inherent in the slave as a person, no freedom regarding marriage, no freedom regarding religious practice, and turned a blind eye to arbitrary penalties and sanction by slaveholders who were in no way bound to respect the personality and humanity of the slave." End quote. Another slavery apologist was Francis Patrick Kenyon, the Archbishop of Baltimore, whose priorities were the tranquility of civil society first, then the good of the Catholic slaveholders, and finally the well-being of the slave. Unlike Protestant authors who were divided over slavery, American Catholics did not agonize or anguish over the brutal enslavement of people of African descent. and instead consented to it. Some, like Bishop Martin, believed that slavery was really a disguised blessing for Africans, who he called the children of the race of Canaan, because through slavery they had received the faith and other advantages in the New World. But he did admit that the noble results of slavery had not been accomplished, since the slaveholders only sought profit and exploitation while brutalizing the enslaved. 3 years after Bishop Martin's letter, Rome found that the bishop was wrong in stating that black people had descended from Canaan, and that they were therefore accursed. And Rome said if there was such a curse, it would not be valid after the redemption of Christ. Further refuting Bishop Martin, the Vatican official wrote, quote, "Experience shows that Negroes placed among Catholics and educated like them can become learned and virtuous people, fit for moral dignity and freedom. From this treatment, we can easily infer that the bishop favors the enemies of the Catholic Church, who accuse her of approving slavery, which is the origin of the vile trade and of the brutal treatment of the Negroes from Africa. It makes the Church unjustly odious. It promotes the mistake of those who believe that the slave trade of the Negroes is lawful." End quote. However, not all Catholics shared the prevailing American attitude toward slavery and racial equality, and there were Catholics that were outspoken critics of slavery. Daniel O'Connell, one of the best-known Catholic laymen in Europe, was one of those men. O'Connell had a deep sense of justice and passionately opposed slavery and joined the cause to abolish slavery in the English colonies. He vehemently condemned slavery in America and was especially distressed by the anti-black sentiment among his fellow Irishmen. So too, Félix Antoine Philibert Dupanloup, Bishop of Orleans, was one of the most influential ecclesiastic and leader of the liberal Catholic movement in France. He championed liberal causes, was the herald who sought to make the Church more alert to the demands of modern society, and condemned the slave trade in America. He believed that based on the Church's teaching that all are transformed by the redemption of Christ, the Catholic Church must oppose slavery. Commenting on the preliminary moves in preparation for President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Dupanloup stated, quote, "There are then on the same earth with myself, children of God and children of men like myself, saved by the same blood that I am, destined to the same heaven that I am. 5 or 6 millions of my fellow beings in the United States, in Brazil, in Cuba, who are slaves. Aged people, vigorous men, women, young girls, children, just heaven. Is it not yet time, after 18 centuries of Christianity, for us all to begin to practice the ever-enduring law, do not to another that which you would not he should do to you?" End quote. There were also a few American Catholic clergy that opposed slavery, such as French priest Claude Pascal Maistre, who in 1856 was pastor of St. Rose Lima Church in New Orleans. Throughout his 5-year tenure in the U.S., he gained the reputation of being an abolitionist, and he began preaching against slavery in 1862. He was suspended and placed under interdict in 1863. Later that year, he built another church in New Orleans, Holy Name of Jesus, which was considered schismatic. He was later reconciled to the church in 1966. The most prominent bishop to come out publicly for the emancipation of the slaves was John Baptist Purcell, who took his first public stand on the issue in 1862. His brother, Father Edward Purcell, was the editor of the archdiocesan newspaper in Cincinnati, the Catholic Telegraph, and used its editorial columns to criticize slavery. During the Civil War, Catholics fought on both sides. Even in the North, the sentiment of the Catholics was mostly anti-black, especially concerning Irish immigrants who saw black people as competing in the labor market. Many abolitionists were viewed negatively by Catholics because the abolitionists themselves were anti-Catholic. Regardless of religion, in the 19th century, there were few white Americans who believed black people were equal to white people. The assumption of black people's inferiority was accepted as part of the social and cultural landscape, which was not questioned. As Cyprian Davis states, quote, Catholics outside of the United States, beginning with the papacy and including both clerics and lay, had developed a moral consciousness that by the middle of the 19th century could no longer tolerate slavery. But the Catholic Church in the United States found itself incapable of taking a decisive action or enunciating clearly thought-out principles regarding slavery. This factor unfortunately prevented the American Church from playing any serious role until the middle of the 20th century and the most tragic debate that this nation had to face. End quote. I would like to add that Venerable Pierre Toussaint, Servant of God, Mother Mary Lang, Venerable Henriette Delille, Venerable Auguste Tolton, who was the first African American priest, and Servant of God Julia Greeley are all people of African descent who lived during slavery and for some long enough to see the end of slavery in the United States. Along with Sister Thea Bowman, these future saints need their own Black Catholic Facts episode, so I won't go into detail on each of their lives just yet, but it's important to note that African American Catholics lived lives worthy of sainthood in the face of the brutality of slavery and dehumanization of Black people. To conclude, we're going to go across the globe to meet another Black Catholic saint. Saint Josephine Bakita was born in 1869 in a small village in the Darfur region of Sudan. She was kidnapped while working in the fields with her family and sold into slavery. She was tortured by various owners and notes one particular instance when a slaveholder cut her 114 times and poured salt in her wounds to make sure the scars would remain. After being sold 5 times, she ended up in Italy, where she learned about the church and was baptized. The man who brought her to Italy wanted to return St. Josephine and his daughter back to Sudan, but Josephine refused, and the disagreement escalated to the Italian courts. It was ruled that Josephine could stay in Italy because she was a free woman. Slavery was not recognized in Italy, and it had also been illegal in Sudan since before Josephine had been born. Saint Bakita remained in Italy and made her profession in 1896. She dedicated her life to assisting her community and teaching others to love God. Saint Josephine was canonized on October 2000 by Pope John Paul II. I hope you enjoyed Black Catholic Facts Episode 2. Please like, share, and make sure to leave a comment about this video. If you're not already, please hit the subscribe button to be kept in the know about all things Black Catholic.